It was a quiet evening when the general left the small community hall after speaking to a group of young cadets. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and a soft orange glow still lingered across the road. He felt peaceful as he drove through the familiar neighborhood, the same one he'd passed countless times before. His uniform jacket rested neatly on the seat beside him, his medals tucked away in a small box. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary man heading home after a long day, and that was how he liked it. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on when he noticed the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought they were meant for someone else. He checked his speed. It was within the limit. The car was registered and insured. There was no reason to be pulled over. Still, the lights stayed behind him and the siren gave a short, sharp wail. He sighed quietly, signaled, and pulled his car over to the side of the road. He rolled down the window and waited, both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. Years in the Army had taught him patience and discipline, even in uncertain situations. A young police officer stepped out of the patrol car and approached his window with a flashlight. The light hit his face directly and the general blinked. The officer's tone was already sharp. Evening, license and registration. The general nodded politely. "Of course, officer," he said, reaching slowly toward his glove compartment. His movements were careful and deliberate. The officer kept the flashlight on him. "What are you doing in this neighborhood tonight?" he asked. "I was just speaking at a youth event a few blocks down," the general replied calmly, handing over his documents. The officer glanced at them briefly, then looked back at him. "This your car?" "Yes," the general said. "It's registered under my name." The officer frowned, still shining the light around the car's interior. "Mind if I ask where you're headed?" "Home," the general answered simply. The officer didn't seem satisfied. He stepped back, walked around the vehicle once, then came back to the window. "Step out of the car for me." The general's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't argue. "May I ask why?" "Just step out," the officer repeated, his voice firmer. The general took a slow breath and unbuckled his seatbelt. "All right," he said, stepping out of the car. He stood tall, shoulders straight, calm in his posture. The officer looked him up and down. "Where are you coming from again?" "I told you," the general said, still polite. "A community hall on West Street." "I was giving a talk." The officer tilted his head. "You said a talk? About what?" "Leadership. Military service. Things like that." The officer gave a short, mocking laugh. "Military, huh?" He held up the license. "You say you're military, but this doesn't say anything about that." "I have my ID card in my wallet," the general replied quietly. "Would you like to see it?" "Yeah," the officer said quickly, extending his hand. The general handed over the card. It clearly showed his full name, photograph, and rank in the U.S. Army. The officer looked at it, squinting under the light, then smirked. "You expect me to believe this?" "It's genuine," the general said simply. "Sure it is," the officer muttered. "You can buy anything online these days." For a moment, the air between them grew heavier. The street was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. The general didn't speak. Years of service had taught him that silence often said more than words. A second patrol car arrived. Another officer stepped out, glancing between them. "Everything all right here?" he asked. "Just checking this guy out," the first officer said. "Claims he's military." The second officer gave the general a brief nod. "Sir, if you just cooperate, this will go faster." "I've been cooperating," the general said evenly. "I'd just like to know why I was pulled over." "You fit the description," the first officer said quickly. "Of who?" "Someone we're looking for." The general looked at him for a moment, realizing the conversation wasn't about facts anymore. It was about power. He had seen that look before overseas in situations where people let their authority speak louder than reason. He stayed still while the officer circled the car again. Then, without asking, the officer opened the driver's door and started checking the inside. "Officer," the general said calmly, "do you have a warrant for this search?" "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked. "You don't tell me how to do my job." "I'm not," the general said quietly. "I'm just asking if this is necessary." The officer suddenly turned around. "You're acting suspicious. Turn around and put your hands on the car." The general stared at him for a brief second, disbelief flickering across his face. "You're making a mistake. Hands on the car." The officer repeated louder this time. The second officer hesitated. "Hey, maybe we should," but the first officer cut him off. "I said hands on the car." The general slowly complied, placing his hands against the cool metal surface. His mind was calm, but inside he felt something heavy, not fear but disappointment. He had given more than 30 years of his life serving his country, protecting people like this young officer, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal without reason. The officer pulled his arms behind his back and tightened the handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting and refusing to follow orders." "I didn't resist," the general said quietly. "You were arguing," the officer snapped. Several people had started watching from their porches. A few took out their phones, recording the scene. The flashing lights reflected off nearby windows. The general didn't raise his voice or struggle. He simply looked at the officer and said, "You should check that ID again before you go any further." Yeah, the officer muttered, pushing him toward the patrol car. As the door closed behind him, the general sat in silence. The car smelled faintly of disinfectant and plastic. Through the window, he could see the young officer pacing around, still talking to his partner. Inside, the general thought about the irony of it all. He had stood in combat zones where the rules of war were clearer than this. He had faced enemies who showed more respect than the man who just arrested him. Yet even now, he refused to let anger take over. He believed in patience. He believed in the system, even when it failed him. After several minutes, the officer opened the door. "You got any weapons on you?" "No," the general replied. "Good," the officer said. "Because if I find something, this will go a lot worse for you." The general said nothing. The ride to the station was quiet, except for the sound of the siren echoing faintly in the distance. The officer kept glancing in the rearview mirror, maybe expecting the man in the back seat to protest. But he didn't. The general just looked out the window, watching the city lights blur by. When they arrived, the officer led him inside, past curious stares from other policemen. A few looked confused, maybe recognizing something familiar in his face or the ID he carried. The general stood straight as they processed him. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle some of them. One of the older officers asked softly, "Sir, what's your name again?" The young officer cut in quickly. "Doesn't matter. We'll verify it later." But the older man still looked uneasy. He took the ID again, studying it under the light. His expression changed slightly, but he didn't say anything yet. The general was placed in a small holding room with a single chair and a metal table. He sat down, resting his hands on the table, the cuffs still around his wrists. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. He thought about his family, about the soldiers under his command who looked up to him as a role model. What would they think if they saw him like this? Then again, he knew what mattered wasn't what others thought. It was how he handled this moment. After all, his rank didn't define his dignity. His actions did. Minutes turned into an hour. The officer who arrested him walked by the window once or twice, shooting him a glance but saying nothing. The general sat patiently, his expression unchanged. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was silence. He wasn't angry, just deeply disappointed. Disappointed that after decades of service, wearing the uniform, defending his country, and leading men and women of all backgrounds, he was still judged not by his record, but by his skin. Yet he didn't let bitterness win. He simply waited, because deep down he knew the truth always surfaced, and when it did, the consequences would speak for themselves. As he sat there, calm and unshaken, one thought crossed his mind. He could end this entire situation with a single phone call. One number would change everything. But not yet. Not until the lesson had fully unfolded. He leaned back in his chair, looked at the blank wall across from him, and whispered quietly to himself, "Patience." Outside, the officer who had arrested him was laughing with a co-worker, unaware of the storm he had just set in motion. The sound of the clock on the wall was the only thing breaking the silence in the small room. The general sat quietly, still in his chair, still patient. Every few minutes an officer walked past the narrow window, glancing in like they weren't sure what to make of him. Some looked curious, others avoided his gaze. He didn't move much. His back stayed straight, his eyes calm. Years of discipline had taught him how to wait without letting frustration show. The officer gave a short laugh, but it was forced. You threatening me? No, the general said softly. Just giving you a fair warning. Outside the room, the young officer who had arrested him was filling out paperwork. His tone was confident, even smug. Yeah, got him near West Street. Said he's a general or something. Probably lying. We'll figure it out when we run the ID. He spoke loudly enough for others to hear, as if he wanted recognition for what he'd done. The older officer at the desk didn't say much, just kept glancing at the ID card resting beside the forms. The name printed on it made his stomach tighten a little. It sounded familiar, too familiar. He'd heard it somewhere before. Maybe on the news or at a local ceremony where high-ranking military officers had been honored. Still, he said nothing yet. Back in the room, the general leaned his head back against the wall. He could feel the tightness of the cuffs around his wrists, but he didn't complain. He'd endured worse. His thoughts wandered to the faces of the young cadets he had spoken to earlier that evening. They had been so full of hope, eager to serve, ready to believe in a country where fairness and respect still meant something. He wondered what they would think if they knew their speaker hadn't even made it home after his talk. After a while, the door opened, and the young officer stepped in again. All right, he said briskly, holding a clipboard. You're being held while we verify your identity. You said you're military, right? Yes, the general replied evenly. Sure, the officer said, almost mocking him again. We'll see what the system says. Until then, you'll stay put. The general looked at him for a long moment before speaking softly. You've made an error tonight, but I'll give you time to realize it yourself. The officer frowned. You think you're better than everyone else, huh? I don't think that, the general said calmly. But I do know when someone is letting pride get in the way of judgment. The officer's face tightened. You don't get to lecture me. I'm not lecturing you, the general replied. I'm reminding you that how you treat people says more about you than it does about them. The young officer stared at him for a few seconds, then turned sharply and left the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the hallway, drawing the attention of another officer nearby. She frowned, looking at the closed door. What's going on with him? She asked. He's in one of his moods again, the older officer said quietly. Pulled over some guy. Says he's a general. A general? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Like military? Yeah, the older man said, lowering his voice. But the name? It's strange. I think I've heard it before, and the ID looks real. If it is, that kid just made one big mistake. The woman glanced toward the holding room. Maybe you should check before this goes too far. I already sent the ID to be verified, he said. Won't take long now. Inside, the general closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. He wasn't angry. He just felt tired. Tired of situations like this, tired of knowing that respect had to be earned twice over because of who he was. He thought about his wife waiting at home, wondering why he hadn't called yet. He knew she'd be worried. She always was when he stayed out too late, even when it was for work. But tonight he didn't want to call until he was certain the situation was handled. He didn't want to worry her unless he had to. The door opened again, this time more gently. The older officer stepped in, holding a file. He studied the man sitting at the table for a few seconds before speaking. Sir, he began carefully. Could you confirm your full name and date of birth? The general answered, his tone respectful but firm. The officer nodded slowly and compared it with the record on the ID. I just want to verify something, the older officer said. It won't take long. That's fine, the general replied quietly. After a few moments, the officer stepped out again, walking down the hallway to the computer terminal. He typed in the information, and within seconds a record appeared on the screen, complete with official Pentagon clearance, military rank, and years of service. The man froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. He wasn't just looking at any soldier's record. This was a highly decorated active-duty U.S. Army general, one who had been publicly recognized for his leadership and service. The older officer swallowed hard, glancing toward the holding room. Oh no, he muttered under his breath. What has that kid done? He picked up the phone immediately. Chief, we have a situation. You need to see this now. Within minutes, the police chief arrived, pulling on his jacket. He looked irritated at first, like he'd been dragged out of an important meeting. What's the issue? The officer handed him the file. This is the man we're holding right now. The chief scanned the name, then froze. You've got to be kidding me. He rubbed his forehead. Who arrested him? Patrolman Reed, the officer said quietly. The chief's expression darkened. Of course it was. He started toward the hallway. Get that man out of cuffs now. Chief, the older officer warned softly. He's still in the holding room. Then what are we waiting for? The chief said sharply. Move. But before they could get there, the young officer had already entered the room again. He was still acting like he was in charge, still certain he'd done the right thing. You know, he said, pacing slowly in front of the general, I've dealt with all kinds of people trying to pretend to be something they're not. You're not the first. The general stayed silent, watching him. See, the officer continued, you thought you could flash a fake ID and scare me off, but it doesn't work like that here. Around here we do things by the book. The general looked at him evenly. Then read your book carefully. Because the chapter you're on right now isn't going to end well for you. The officer rolled his eyes. Save it. Before he could say anything else, the door swung open and the police chief stepped in. The expression on his face made the young officer instantly step back. Take off those cuffs, the chief ordered. The officer blinked. Sir? Now. The chief barked. Do you have any idea who you've just arrested? The young officer looked confused. He said he was a general, but he is a general, the chief snapped. And not just any general. He's one of the most respected officers in the U.S. Army. The young officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face went pale. The chief turned toward the general. Sir, I am deeply sorry. This is unacceptable. I take full responsibility for the actions of my officer. The general slowly stood. His wrists were red where the cuffs had been. He didn't yell or demand anything. He simply said, Chief, I understand mistakes happen, but this one could have been avoided with a little patience and respect. The chief nodded quickly. You're absolutely right, sir. I assure you this will be dealt with immediately. The young officer stood frozen, staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His pride had drained away completely. The general looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, only disappointment. Son, he said quietly, you wear that badge to protect people, not to judge them. Remember that before you do something like this again. The officer swallowed hard, but couldn't reply. The chief gestured toward the door. Sir, would you like to make a call or have an escort home? The general nodded once. A call will do. He followed the chief into the hallway. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than the last. The station, once filled with casual chatter, was now silent. Every officer seemed to be holding their breath as he passed. Some stood, straightened up, and saluted instinctively, realizing who he was. In the office, the general picked up the phone. He dialed a number from memory, a secure Pentagon line. When someone answered, he spoke calmly, his voice steady but direct. This is General Thompson. I've been detained by local authorities. It's been resolved, but I'd like a formal note logged for record. The voice on the other end responded quickly and respectfully. Understood, sir. We'll take care of it immediately. The general hung up the phone and turned to the chief. I'm not interested in ruining anyone's career tonight, he said quietly. But I do expect you to make this a learning moment for your department. Yes, sir, the chief said firmly. We will. The general looked back toward the holding area one last time. The young officer stood there, still frozen, eyes downcast. The general didn't say another word. He simply walked past him, calm and dignified, as though the entire night had been nothing more than a test of character. When he stepped outside, the night air felt cool against his face. He took a deep breath, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the quiet wash over him. Then he walked toward his car, which had already been brought around, and got in. He drove off slowly, not angry, not bitter, just thoughtful. Because in his heart he knew that sometimes lessons come in the most unexpected ways. And tonight, a very important one had just begun. The drive home was quiet. The general kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts drifting between disbelief and calm acceptance. The streetlights passed in soft blurs, their yellow glow brushing across the windshield. He didn't play the radio. He didn't make another call. He just needed time to let the night settle in his mind. He had been through so much worse in life. Foreign battlefields, sleepless nights in desert bases, situations where fear and chaos were louder than reason. But somehow what had just happened in his own country, in his own neighborhood, felt heavier. It wasn't about one rude officer or one mistake. It was about something deeper, something that never seemed to fade no matter how much progress people claimed had been made. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the sky had turned dark blue. The porch light was on, and through the window he could see his wife sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The sight of her steadied him. When he walked in, she stood up immediately. "You're late," she said softly, concern showing in her eyes. He took off his coat and hung it by the door. "I know," he said quietly. "Something unexpected happened," she frowned. "What kind of something?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I got pulled over. It turned into more than it should have." She stared at him, her voice rising slightly. "What do you mean more than it should have?" He walked over, took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I'm fine. It's over now, but it wasn't right." She sat back down slowly, her hand still in his. "You didn't call me." "I didn't want to worry you," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was handled first." She looked at him, trying to understand. "Did they know who you were?" He gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Not at first. For a long time they sat in silence. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. He finally told her everything, from the flashing lights on the road to the moment the police chief realized the mistake. She listened without interrupting, but he could see the disbelief in her face growing with each word. When he finished, she leaned back and shook her head. "After everything you've done." "After everything you've given?" Her voice broke a little. "It's not fair." He reached across the table and touched her hand again. "No," he said softly, "it's not. But I can't carry anger for it. It won't help anyone." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing yet," he said. "I made a call to the Pentagon, so there's a record. They'll handle the rest." The next morning, the phone started ringing before sunrise. The general hadn't even finished his first cup of coffee when his assistant from the Pentagon called. "Sir, we received your report last night," the young man said on the line. "It's already being reviewed. The Department of Defense has contacted the local police department for clarification." "I see," the general said calmly. "I didn't intend for this to become a big issue." "With respect, sir," the assistant said, "it already is." Word got around quickly. Several officials are asking for details. They want to make sure the situation is handled properly. The general sighed quietly. "All right. Keep me updated." When he hung up, his wife looked at him from across the room. "So it's already moving?" "Yes," he said. "Faster than I expected." He didn't go into work that day. Instead, he sat by the window reading the morning paper. He wasn't in uniform, but he still carried himself like a man on duty, calm, focused, and disciplined. The phone rang a few more times throughout the morning, each call coming from someone higher up the chain of command. They all expressed the same thing: shock, apology, and a promise to handle it. By noon, the local police station was already buzzing with tension. The chief had been on the phone since early morning, speaking in a low, serious voice. He hadn't slept much. Neither had the young officer who caused all of this. The moment he walked into the station, everyone went silent. His confidence was gone. His steps were slower, his expression heavy. The chief finally called him into his office. "Close the door," he said. The officer obeyed, his hands trembling slightly. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" the chief asked, his tone tired rather than angry. The officer stared at the floor. "Sir, I didn't know who he was." "That's not the point," the chief said. "You didn't need to know who he was. You needed to treat him with respect like you would treat anyone else." "I thought he was lying," the officer muttered. "And why did you think that?" the chief pressed. The officer didn't answer right away. He finally said, "Because it didn't seem like he belonged there." The chief's eyes narrowed. "You're going to have to explain what that means." The officer swallowed hard but couldn't find the right words. The silence that followed was louder than anything else. The chief leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That man you arrested has more honor in one sleeve of his uniform than most people will earn in a lifetime. He spent decades protecting this country, and you treated him like a criminal. Do you realize how serious this is?" The officer nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "Yes, sir. It's not just a mistake," the chief continued. "It's a failure of judgment, and it's going to have consequences." Meanwhile, outside the station, several reporters had started gathering. Somehow, the story had leaked. It wasn't official yet, but the whispers were spreading fast. that a decorated military general had been wrongfully arrested during a routine stop. By the afternoon, the Pentagon had officially contacted the city's mayor, and the mayor in turn called the police chief personally. The tone was direct. "Fix this before it becomes national news," the mayor warned. The chief assured him that he was already doing everything possible. Later that day, the general received another call, this time from a high-ranking defense official. "Sir," the voice said, "the secretary's office is aware of what happened. They've spoken to local authorities. You can expect a formal apology within 24 hours. The general thanked him but kept his voice neutral. "I'm not seeking attention or punishment," he said. "I just want it handled the right way." "We understand, sir," the official replied. "But you should know the media already picked up on it. It's likely to go public soon." The general closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't want his face on the news. He didn't want his story twisted or turned into something it wasn't. All he had wanted was accountability, not fame. But some things were beyond his control now. By evening, photos from the traffic stop had begun circulating online. Someone from the neighborhood had posted a short video from their phone. The flashing lights, the calm man standing outside the car, the officer's harsh tone. The caption read, "This man said he's a U.S. Army general. Look how they treated him." Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. Comment sections flooded with disbelief and anger. Some people recognized the general immediately. Others couldn't believe what they were seeing. The story spread from one platform to another. News outlets started calling for statements. At the police station, the chief held a press briefing. His face was tense but composed. "We deeply regret the events of last night," he said. "An internal review is underway. The department has reached out to the individual involved to issue a personal apology. This does not reflect our values." Reporters shouted questions, but he didn't take any. That same evening, the general sat in his living room, watching the coverage on TV. His wife sat beside him, her hand resting on his. The camera showed his picture next to the story headline, "Decorated U.S. General Wrongfully Detained During Traffic Stop." She looked at him quietly. "It's everywhere now," she said. He nodded. "I know. What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said after a pause. "The truth is already doing the work." She studied him for a moment. "You're not angry?" He shook his head. "No, anger only burns the person who holds it. What matters now is what comes from this. If it helps even one officer learn to see people differently, maybe it was worth it." He turned off the TV. The room went silent again. Outside, the world was buzzing, but inside he found peace in the quiet. That night, while the internet raged and headlines multiplied, the general sat at his desk and wrote a short letter. He didn't write it to the police or the media. He wrote it to his cadets, the same young people he'd spoken to just before the incident. He wrote about dignity, patience, and how to stand firm in the face of unfairness without losing your grace. He ended the letter with one line, "True strength isn't shown by how loud you shout, but by how calm you stay when others forget your worth." He sealed the letter and placed it on his desk, ready to send in the morning. Then he sat back, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "Let the truth do its job." And somewhere, in that same moment, the phone on the police chief's desk rang again. A direct call from Washington. The tone on the other end was short and sharp. "We need to talk about what happened last night." The storm was far from over. The phone call the general made only lasted a few seconds. But inside that small police station, those few seconds changed everything. After he hung up, the room went quiet. The officers around him didn't know what to do. The one who had arrested him was pacing back and forth trying to look calm, but his hands were shaking slightly. The older officer who had entered earlier stood still, looking at the general like he suddenly realized who he really was. The general sat there quietly. His face was calm, but his eyes were steady. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared either. It was as if he had seen worse, and this moment, no matter how unfair, was not going to shake him. He had faced more dangerous situations in his years of service, but this felt different. This was his own country, the one he had dedicated his life to protecting. And yet, here he was, treated like a criminal for no reason. And a few minutes later, the phone at the front desk rang. The young officer answered it. As he listened, his eyes widened. He whispered something to the officer next to him, and soon both of them were looking in the general's direction. The older officer took the phone from his hand, listened quietly, and then straightened his posture. "Yes, sir. Understood." That was all he said before hanging up. He turned to the arresting officer and said in a low but firm voice, "We need to release him. Now." The younger officer frowned, confused. "What do you mean, release him?" Before he could finish, the older man cut him off. "You have no idea who you've just arrested." The general looked up and spoke softly. "No need to argue. Just follow your protocol. Everything will be clear in a few minutes," and he was right. It didn't even take 10 minutes before the entire place turned upside down. The police chief himself rushed in, still wearing a jacket over his nightclothes. His face was red, his hair messy, but his tone was serious. He went straight to the holding area and stopped when he saw the general sitting calmly on the bench. "General, sir, I can't even begin to tell you how sorry I am." The chief's voice trembled slightly. He motioned for the keys. "Get these cuffs off him right now." The arresting officer hesitated, looking between the chief and the general. His face had lost all its earlier arrogance. The chief snapped again, louder this time, "Now." He fumbled with the keys and unlocked the cuffs. The general rubbed his wrists gently, though the marks weren't too deep. He gave a polite nod but said nothing. The chief took a deep breath. "Sir, I've just been informed that your call went through to the Pentagon. They're sending someone down here. Please believe me when I say we had no idea who you were." The general looked at him calmly and replied, "That's exactly the point. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." That one sentence hung heavy in the air. No one knew how to respond. Minutes later, the sound of approaching engines filled the quiet night. 2 black SUVs stopped right outside the station, their headlights cutting through the glass doors. Several men in dark suits and one uniformed officer stepped out. Their presence instantly changed the atmosphere. The chatter stopped. Phones were set down. Even the air seemed still. When they walked in, the officer in uniform approached the general and saluted sharply. "Sir, we received your call. Are you all right?" The general stood, straightened his posture, and nodded. "I'm fine. Thank you for coming so quickly." He didn't raise his voice or demand anything. Instead, his calmness carried more power than any anger could have. The men who had disrespected him earlier now stood silently in the corner. Unable to look him in the eye, the chief stepped forward, stammering, "Sir, please understand, this was a terrible misunderstanding. I assure you disciplinary action will be taken." The general gave a faint, tired smile. "It's not about me, Chief. I just hope you take a hard look at how this could happen in the first place." The chief nodded quickly, his face pale. "We will, sir. I promise." Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Someone had recognized the general when the SUVs arrived, and word spread fast. People started recording, whispering among themselves as they saw the man walk out of the building, still composed, still dignified. The general paused at the door and looked back at the officers. "You wear that badge to protect people, not to judge them. Remember that." Then he stepped outside. The cameras caught the moment perfectly. The quiet strength, the grace under pressure, and the clear difference between authority used for good and power, abused for ego. It was a scene that no one there would ever forget. When the general reached the SUV, the officer in uniform opened the door for him. But before getting in, he turned and looked at the crowd. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes. About patience, about dignity, about justice that didn't need to shout to be heard. As the vehicles drove away, the police station was left in silence. The arresting officer sat down, his head in his hands. He finally whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." The older officer beside him replied quietly, "That's the problem. You didn't think at all?" Inside his office, the chief sat at his desk staring at the phone. Calls were already coming in from the governor's office, from reporters, and from Washington. He knew this wasn't just going to go away. His department had just become the center of a national story. By morning, news vans were lined up outside the station. Reporters wanted statements. Headlines were already spreading online. Decorated U.S. Army general wrongfully detained by local police. Photos of the general leaving the station began circulating, and the story quickly reached national channels. Meanwhile, the general didn't speak to the press. He went home quietly, just as he had planned to the night before. His family was waiting, worried but proud. He assured them he was fine. He sat down at his kitchen table, looked out the window, and took a deep breath. The night had been long, but he wasn't angry. He felt sad, not for himself, but for the country he loved so much. The next morning, the Pentagon issued an official statement confirming the general's rank and service record. They didn't criticize the police directly, but made it clear that the incident was being reviewed. That single announcement added even more attention to the case. Back in the small town, the mayor held an emergency meeting. Community members gathered, some furious, others ashamed. The same officer who had made the arrest sat silently at the back, his head down. He had never imagined that one rash night would turn into something this big. As the discussion went on, a woman from the neighborhood stood up. She had witnessed the arrest. If that man hadn't been who he was, she said, he could have spent the night in jail for no reason. That's what's wrong. This isn't about one mistake. It's about how easily people are judged. Her words got applause from many in the room. For the first time, the officer felt the weight of what he had done. It wasn't just about a bad decision. It was about trust, about fairness, about something that went much deeper than he had thought. That night, the chief called the general to apologize once more. "Sir," he said quietly, "I can't fix what happened, but I'd like to meet you in person to discuss how we can prevent it from happening again." The general listened for a moment, then agreed. "All right, Chief, let's talk. But I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in change." The conversation was short but sincere. The chief promised to arrange a meeting between the general and the department staff later that week. Outside, the town that had been just another quiet place on the map suddenly became a symbol of something bigger. A story about respect, prejudice, and what true leadership looks like. The general didn't post anything online. He didn't give interviews or speeches. But the image of him walking out of that station, calm and proud, spread across the country. It inspired many and reminded others that strength isn't in anger, it's in grace under pressure. By the time the week ended, everyone, from small-town officers to top officials, had heard about the incident. The Pentagon had made several quiet calls to ensure accountability was taken seriously. The message was clear. No one, not even those with authority, was above fairness. And though the general returned to his duties, his calm defiance that night continued to echo far beyond that police station, a reminder that dignity doesn't need power to stand tall, only truth. The next few days changed everything. What had started as a routine traffic stop had now turned into a story everyone was talking about. News channels replayed the video of the general walking out of the police station with calm dignity. It was shared millions of times online. People were struck not only by what happened to him, but by how he reacted, quietly, respectfully, and with strength. Across the country, many were angry at the injustice, but they also admired how he handled it. He didn't shout, he didn't insult anyone, and he didn't demand special treatment. He simply showed patience and self-control in a moment when most people would have lost their temper. That calmness, that quiet power made his story even more powerful. Meanwhile, the police department was under heavy pressure. Reporters camped outside the station, waiting for statements. The chief appeared on local television, looking exhausted and regretful. He admitted mistakes were made and said a full review was underway. "We're committed to learning from this," he told reporters. "No one should be treated unfairly, no matter who they are." Still, people wanted accountability. The officer who had made the arrest was suspended pending investigation. Some demanded he be fired, while others argued he needed education, not punishment. The town became divided, but one thing was clear. This incident had forced everyone to look closely at themselves. As all this unfolded, the general kept away from the public eye. He stayed home, spending time with his family, avoiding interviews. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls from journalists, friends, and officials, but he answered very few. He wasn't interested in fame or revenge. He had lived long enough to know that anger doesn't solve what wisdom can. On the third day, the Pentagon reached out formally. They assured him that the situation was being handled with the seriousness it deserved. They also asked if he wanted to file a complaint or pursue legal action. He declined. "I'm not doing this for myself," he said. "But I want something to change.